Hey, welcome everyone to Communication Across the Curriculum, or CAC, this afternoon. And today we honor Mark Whitten, who's going to speak with us today from the Department of Philosophy, and his title is, I have the old title, On William James. The new title is What I Have Learned from William James. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
All right. Well, it's good to be here with you this afternoon. Again, I am not going to claim to be an expert on the thought of William James, but he is one of my most favorite philosophers, and I think there are a number of reasons why he's an important figure to know something about. And he has influenced me or affected me or provoked me in a number of ways in developing into the positions I've developed now. I don't remember exactly for sure when I first became aware of William James, but I think it was when I bought this book here. I was a seminary student at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. I was just hanging around the bookstore one day, and I'd already determined that I was interested in philosophy of religion, and I came across this classical and contemporary readings in the philosophy of religion, edited by John Hick. Well, this in part was my introduction to John Hick, who has also been a major influence upon my development of my thought in philosophy of religion. But included in this anthology of writings in the philosophy of religion, you do have a couple of writings by William James, including The Will to Believe. And as a testimony to William James, he died in 1910, that if you do have an anthology in philosophy, and particularly an anthology in the philosophy of religion, you are very likely to have at least one article from William James. Been a lot of philosophy done since 1910. A lot of very good articles, very influential articles. And yet here you have this philosopher, and in particular the essay, The Will to Believe, is regularly reprinted in philosophy of religion anthologies or in the philosophy of religion section of an anthology. I have discovered that in William James there's something of a kindred spirit. There's a kind of resonance between his attitude and his approach to things and my attitude and approach to things. I certainly believe that William James is essential reading for any fully educated person in either psychology or the philosophy of religion, but I think very instructive and important even if you're not a participant in those two fields. He is known as the father of American psychology. He did begin his career primarily as a psychologist, and we'll look at a timeline in just a moment that indicates that. But he's also one of America's foremost philosophers. Some have said that America has had really three major novel philosophers, one of them being Jonathan Edwards, the second being Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the third being William James. So whatever your relative assessment of William James, there's no question he's of great importance in psychology, very important in philosophy, particularly American philosophy. And I have provided a timeline that I think everybody should have a copy except me, but now I have one. And you'll notice that he was born in 1842 in the state of New York. He was educated at Harvard University and he received his MD in 1869. To my knowledge, this is his only terminal academic degree, a medical doctorate. He started out as an instructor of anatomy and physiology at Harvard University. In 1876, he became an assistant professor of physiology. In 1880, he moved to being an assistant professor of philosophy. For 1889 to 1897, a professor of psychology, and then 1890, his Principles of Psychology came out, which is a standard, it's a classic, as I understand, in the field of psychology. 1897, The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy. This includes also a couple of other very famous and very influential essays, The Sentiment of Rationality and The Dilemma of Determinism. And this really marks his transition to becoming more the philosopher and less the psychologist. 1897, he became professor of philosophy. 1901, 1902, he presented the Clifford Lectures, which is a very prestigious lectureship. And these were published subsequently as The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is generally credited with being the first scientific, the first psychological investigation of religious experience. 1906 is one of his major works, Pragmatism, again in 1909, Pluralistic Universe. These are only the major works. He wrote other things as well, and he died in 1910. So a number of the ways in which he has influenced me, challenged me, and one is the relationship between philosophy and psychology. And I tell my students in philosophy, you cannot do good philosophy with knowing something about psychology. Now, I wouldn't say that's just true of psychology. I think it's true of sociology as well, and other areas of discipline. Really, philosophy draws upon all of the disciplines, and you cannot do good philosophy in ignorance of the other disciplines. But I think there's a special connection between philosophy and psychology, particularly when you're dealing with knowledge and philosophy of mind and some sorts of things. You can't do the philosophy without consulting the science. I also happen to believe you can't do good psychology without knowing something about philosophy. Because scientists make assumptions, and sometimes they don't recognize they're making assumptions or don't understand the power of those assumptions. And scientists make inferences. And again, sometimes the inferences that scientists may draw are well-drawn inferences, and perhaps sometimes they're not so well-drawn inferences. So I do think psychology makes a very important contribution to philosophy. Philosophy, I think, makes a significant contribution to psychology. And here we have this individual who was both. He actually taught during the time in which psychology and philosophy had not been separated in the academic disciplines. So there was no separate philosophy department and psychology department at Harvard University until William James came on the scene. Psychology was actually an area with what was called natural philosophy. But if I'm remembering correctly, William James set up the first experimental laboratory in psychology. And so one of his contributions, more than perhaps others or anybody else, is he contributed to this separation, this division between psychology as a science and, again, philosophy as, well, not a science, part of the liberal arts perspective. So I like that interplay of psychology and philosophy. I happen to have an undergraduate minor in sociology, so I do think that sociology comes into good stead. I don't know near as much about mathematics as I used to know or should know, but when you're dealing with things like Bayes' theorem and things like that, there's some things you need to know about mathematics as well. So these divisions we make are somewhat artificial. Second way in which William James has influenced my thinking is the primacy of living and acting and thinking for philosophy. Philosophers have a temptation to live to think. But I think that philosophers like William James remind us that really we think to live. That there is a primacy of the practical. We are actors making our way in the world. And philosophy should make enough connection with real life and real people so that it serves as some kind of aid, some kind of guide in terms of our practices and understanding our experiences. And certainly James, along with Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey, very instrumental in developing this particular school of philosophy, perspective philosophy known as pragmatism. If there's one particularly American contribution to the discipline of philosophy, it has been the development of this perspective of pragmatism. And so he's very important here. I like that as a part of his pragmatic point of view, he embraced what he called a broad versus a narrow empiricism. A narrow empiricism is an empiricism that assumes materialism. The only real, true experience is material or material experiences. A narrow empiricism assumes scientism. The only proper way of knowing anything at all are the methods of science. If it's not a scientific question, it's not a real question. If it's not a scientific answer, it's not a real answer. And therefore, people's understanding of experience, many people's understanding of experience, has been within a materialistic, scientific, and reductionistic framework. But James was open to all types of experience. He didn't think we should approach experience in an a priori manner, dictating ahead of time what experience has to be or what it cannot be. We ought to be open to experience and to achieving the best understanding that we can achieve. And I haven't always been true to any of these insights or perspectives, I think, but they have been important factors in my thinking. This pragmatic perspective, again, is to be contrasted to rationalism in philosophy. William James had some very critical things to say about rationalism. It's to be contrasted, though, to the kind of empiricism you would find in a Locke or a Hume or others, their followers. He had some very critical things to say about, again, a kind of narrow empiricism. The third general perspective in philosophy has been Kantian perspective, Kantian philosophy. But again, William James offers a contrast. Pragmatism offers a contrast to either the Kantian perspective on knowledge and reality, the traditional empiricist perspective on knowledge and reality, or the rationalist perspective on knowledge and reality. Another area in which William James has influenced my thinking is his affirmation of contextualism and fallibilism. Any claims that we made with regards to truth are contextual claims. Any claims that we make to truth are fallible claims. They might prove to be false. Any claims that we make to truth certainly are not the complete or the final truth. And William James has his own way of reminding us that anything that we assert, anything that we affirm has a context. Anything that we assert or affirm could possibly be false, almost surely is incomplete or inadequate. And I at least contrast this in my own mind to a kind of relativistic subjectivism. I'm not sure how many people actually subscribe to relativist subjectivism, but basically the idea that anything goes in terms of belief, one opinion's as good as another. There's really no way of arguing that one perspective might be superior or better than another's. You can be a contextualist and a fallibilist without being a subjective relativist. Also oppose it to radical skepticism, the kind of idea that maybe we don't know or not justified in claiming to know or believe anything at all. James counsels that we can have an openness to experience. We can certainly be skeptical about particular methods and particular claims without engaging in some kind of radical skepticism that calls all of our knowledge-seeking efforts into question. And James is certainly opposed to dogmatism, which I want to be opposed to as well. The idea that we can be closed, that we can kind of wrap everything up in a nice little bow because we finally arrived at truth with a capital T, and there are really no more considerations, no more investigations to take place. So in contrast to dogmatism, radical skepticism, and subjective relativism, I think that James's pragmatism, his approach, is preferable. I like his openness to experience. Not only does he affirm that there are experiences, but he also affirms that there are experiences of the connections between experiences as well. And there's a basic coherence that we pursue with regards to our experiences. So there's a lot about his view of experience that commends itself to me. I like his critical realism. Naive realism says, well, my beliefs copy reality. My beliefs mirror reality. My beliefs, my truths picture reality. That's a kind of naive realism about our language and about our claims. An anti-realism posits a kind of radical disconnection. What I believe is one thing and what reality is something perhaps completely different. James, I think, could be seen as a proponent of what we could call critical realism. He continues actually to use the language, affirm correspondence between our beliefs and our ideas and reality. He just doesn't understand correspondence in the traditional way. He doesn't view it as a mirroring of reality or a copying of reality. He uses the language of agreement or fit, which is a more dynamic understanding of correspondence that I have found congenial. Like many thinkers, he has emphasized as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries the primacy of process over substance. Traditional philosophy used the concept of substance and talked about substances, where realities are kind of things, kind of stuffs. And James and others would emphasize the dynamic nature of reality, that maybe instead of using nouns, we ought to use verbs about what's going on in the world. Maybe instead of things, we ought to talk about events, about what's going on in the world. And again, I found this very challenging and in many ways very congenial as well. And I'm just listing a few of these. I'm going to kind of focus on a couple of things where he may influence me in a significant way. Also, he has emphasized for me the role of the importance of personal psychology and personal temperament in all of our intellectual endeavors. He made distinctions between tender-minded and tough-minded people, not necessarily affirming or disparaging one side or the other, just saying some people are more tender-minded, some people are more tough-minded, and he filled out those categories. Tender-minded people tend to be more credulous. They tend to be idealists. They tend to be rationalists. Tough-minded people tend to be more skeptical. They tend to be more empirical. They tend to be pluralists rather than monists in their view of reality. He distinguished between a healthy soul and the sick soul, in part because William James knew what it was to be depressed. His philosophy can be seen very much as his dealing with depression and triumphing over depression to a significant degree in a couple of years, 1869 to 1870. Again, he makes this distinction between a more credulous and more skeptical approach to belief, and between and emphasizing one's passional nature in philosophy, as contrasted to people who sometimes think of themselves as very dispassionate. And the importance of emotions, and the importance of inclinations, and the importance of passions in how we conduct our thinking and the conclusions to which we draw. He proposed what he called meliorism as contrasted to either optimism or pessimism. Some people are very optimistic about the world. We're going to be able to establish this grand utopia. James was realistic enough to think that that was highly questionable. Some people are extremely pessimistic about the world. They think there's basically nothing we can do. It's all going to hell in a handbasket. It's going to be some grand dystopia. And James emphasized that we can make a difference in the world. We can at least make some improvements in the world. We can try to make the world a better place, even if we cannot establish a utopia. But we don't have to somehow resign ourselves to some kind of dystopian existence. And then he's been very helpful for me in helping me to understand and deal with differences, different ways of thinking, different ways of thinking. First of all, he simply affirms the fact of pluralism. People, in fact, do think differently. You can't talk to a colleague or colleagues. You can't attend a CAC session without recognizing that people of sound mind and good character, good friends, highly intellectual people have some very different beliefs and come to some very different conclusions. There's a great pluralism of belief and value and practice. This is inevitable. It's unavoidable. James recognized it was both inevitable and unavoidable. But he also saw it as a very positive thing. He actually viewed it as giving us a window on the way reality is. He talked about it being a pluralistic universe. This is not simply our weaknesses, our incapacities, that we have all these great pluralism of views. That's the nature of reality, that it lends itself to plural perspectives, that it can't be summed up in one grand vision or one grand theory. Which has encouraged me in my better moments to deal with differences with a spirit of humility and good humor. First of all, humility. Just because someone disagrees with me doesn't mean that they're wrong. They might be right and I might be the one that's wrong. Or there might be a fairly healthy mix of error and correct view on both of our sides. A bit humility and good humor. That's just the way things are. We can either get angry about it, always wear a big frown on our face, or we can take it good humor and have a smile as well. And then lastly, as kind of a segue, the role of will. Now again, there are perhaps two major thinkers that emphasize the role of will in philosophy, one of them being Friedrich Nietzsche and the other one being William James. I have been challenged by both of these thinkers. I find William James's approach to the will a bit more congenial than Friedrich Nietzsche's approach to will, and in part that would be the person I am and how I approach these issues and the kind of issues and concerns I have. But again, William James in his own way affirmed the importance of will in our philosophizing, beginning with the question of God belief. So I've given a handout here that summarizes William James's will to believe in the lower part of the handout. He was responding to a very classic essay in the philosophy of religion by William King Clifford, The Ethics of Belief. And Clifford had held that it's always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Put it in a more positive way, if you're going to believe something responsibly, you have to have sufficient evidence. Now, William K. Clifford was a self-styled agnostic. He did not believe in God. Well, in previous CAC presentations, I've I think, demonstrated actually that agnosticism breaks down into agnostic atheism and agnostic theism. You can be a practical atheist if you're agnostic. You can also be a practical theist if you're an agnostic. There's no question that William K. Clifford was an agnostic atheist. God simply did not figure into his thinking, his valuing, his judgments, or his actions. He argued that there's simply not enough evidence to justify belief in God, and therefore Clifford said you should suspend judgment. You shouldn't have a belief either way. Well, James took a contrary point of view. He held that in certain situations, and it's not just situations regarding the existence of God, we have the right to believe something because we choose to believe it, because we desire to believe it. Now again, I've listed the 4 criteria by which this would take place. James has been misunderstood by some to say, well, you can just choose to believe anything you want to believe. Or you can choose purely based upon your passional or emotional nature. James never said such a thing at all. James held, first of all, that if reason can decide, it ought to decide. If there's sufficient evidence to justify a belief or a claim one way or the other, you ought to go with the evidence. You ought to go with reason. You ought to draw the conclusion that sufficient evidence supports. But James recognized there are some interesting issues that the evidential considerations are difficult. They're complex. That there's not sufficient evidence to draw a conclusion one way or the other. Does that necessarily mean that we're required to suspend a belief, not have a belief either way, not take a stand either way? And James said no, that if in addition to a situation being ambiguous, which you see explained there, if a belief is a live option, we find it believable, we find it plausible. If it's a forced option, we're forced either to act, to believe, or not to act or believe, and there are concrete consequences depending upon which action we choose, either to believe or not to believe. And if it's momentous, if it's important. If in a situation of ambiguity, a particular option is live, it's momentous, and it's forced. James held that you are within your rights to believe simply because you desire or choose to do so, based upon what he called your passional nature. That we're not forced simply to suspend judgment there. Which makes a lot of sense to me because I think it applies not only to theological questions, questions of the existence of God, but also other questions, and I'll make an application which I've made in the past in just a few moments. On the other side, you'll have something, a take of mine from something that also appears in James's essay, The Will to Believe, between 2 different orientations that one can have with regards to the adoption of belief. You can have a gain truth approach, a gain truth policy, a gain truth strategy, or you can have an avoid error approach. Avoid error policy, avoid strategy. In my judgment, he rightly pointed out these are not the same things under different descriptions. Now, the development of that is Whitten after the gain truth, the avoid error. Okay? That's not William James, that's my development. So I've articulated the highest value of the gain truth strategy is to believe something if it's true. That's your number one value. If something is true, you want to believe it. The highest value of the avoid error strategy is to avoid error. If something is false, you don't want to believe it. Again, that's not the same orientation. That's not the same strategy under different descriptions. One is to gain the truth, believe something if it's true, and the other is not to believe something if it's false. Here's where the passional nature comes into play in terms of fears and the risks that you accept. Doxastic means belief-related, okay? The doxastic or belief-related fear of the gain truth is not believing P, but P is true. That's what you fear. P, whatever it be, a claim is true, but your fear is that you won't believe that it's true and miss out on whatever benefits there would come with the belief. The doxastic fear of the avoid error strategy is different. They fear believing something, but then it's false. The acceptable risk for the gain truth strategy is, well, you recognize that I might believe something according to my approach, even though it's false. But you're willing to risk believing something that's false because your highest value is being sure you believe it if it's true. The acceptable risk for the avoid error strategy is not believing P, though P is true. You're willing to lose out on truth. You recognize that's the risk of being more skeptical and your goal of not believing something that's false. Please notice something. The fear of the gain truth strategy is the acceptable risk of the avoid error strategy. The fear of the avoid error strategy is the acceptable risk of the gain truth strategy. These two strategies differ in what they fear the most, and they differ in what they're willing to risk. If you're willing to risk believing something, but it might be false because you want to gain truth, that's a more credulous approach. If you are willing to risk not believing something, but it's true because you're trying to avoid all error, that's the more skeptical approach. Credulous or skeptical, each has its own different type of fear. Credulous or skeptical, each has its acceptable risk. But the acceptable risk of one is the rejected fear of the other. The rejected fear of the other is the acceptable risk of the one. So when it comes to burden of proof, when it comes to the type of evidence you would require, the burden of proof is less strict for the gain truth strategy. Because you recognize there are going to be some things that are true that just don't have as much evidence as you wish it had. Some things can be true, but there's not sufficient evidence to establish that they're true. You recognize that that's sometimes the case. And if you're out to believe something, if it's true, you're going to put less barriers to that belief. You're going to require less evidence. Okay? Burden of proof is much more strict with the avoid error strategy. You're skeptical. You don't want to believe things that are false. You recognize that there are some things that may not have a whole lot of evidence that they're false, but nevertheless they are in fact false. So you're going to be much more skeptical. You're going to have much more evidence before you accept something because you're trying to avoid error from the avoid error strategy. The welcome result of the gain truth strategy, you're going to have more true beliefs. The unwelcome result, you're also going to have more false beliefs because you're going to have more beliefs in general. Because you're not as strict with the burden of proof. You don't require as much evidence, which means you're going to have more beliefs. And some of them are going to be true, and you're glad about that. Some of them are going to be false. You're going to have more false beliefs, but that's the risk that you're at. With regards to avoid error strategy, there are fewer false beliefs because you had a greater, stricter burden of proof. You required more evidence. And you're glad about that. You have fewer false beliefs. You're also going to have fewer true beliefs because you have fewer beliefs in general. And some things that were true just didn't have enough evidence to make it through to you. So even though they're true, you're going to have fewer false beliefs. Now, the point that I make in this, and then we're going to move on to something else. This has a major role to play in decisions whether or not to believe in God. Hopefully, and I know we've run through this rather quickly, but if you have an opportunity to look back, it should be very clear that if you adopt a gain truth strategy, it's going to be easier to believe in God. You want to believe in God if God exists. And therefore, you have a less strict burden of proof. You don't require as much evidence, you're more credulous. If you have an avoid error strategy, it's going to be much more difficult to believe in God. Because you're going to be focused upon the lack of evidence or lack of sufficient evidence in your judgment. And your concern is not to believe anything if it's false, and particularly perhaps we don't want to believe the claim that God exists if that's a false claim. So it's going to be a much harder for the skeptic or the skeptically inclined, or the skeptically temperamental person to believe in God. I think just some people are just more naturally skeptical and some people are more naturally credulous. Account for it how you will. And therefore they approach interesting questions, at least an interesting question to me, does God exist, in either a more credulous frame of mind, gain truth approach, or a more skeptical frame of mind, avoid error. William King Clifford was an avoid error person. William James is saying there's nothing wrong with being a gain truth person, because you have the right to choose your own risk. You have the right to take your own chances. Either side is taking some risk of being wrong, as well as some chance of being right. Now, where I applied this to an issue other than God was regarding an issue that I've done a little bit of work in, not so much recently, but in the past. I've done some work in religious liberty issues, church-state issues, First Amendment issues. And even before I came on staff here in 2000, I published a little book, The Myth of Christian America, What You Need to Know About the Separation of Church and State. And at that time, it had a niche. It fulfilled a need between the big books and the journal articles that scholars would write and what people were hearing in the pews of churches. I tried to take what the scholars were writing and put it in a format in which people in the pew could read and benefit from that. Now, happily, in the last 15 some odd years, there are many other books that are better than my book that now do the same thing. But back then, those books didn't exist. So this book did get a little bit of notice when it came out. It has made occasional appearances with mentions in some of the scholarly literature. One of them actually fairly recently, the last couple of years. But what I did, and you'll see that as a part of chapter 8 of my book, I adopted this Jamesian approach of belief strategies to questions of First Amendment jurisprudence. Now, the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Traditionally, there's been talk of the two religion clauses. One clause, no law respecting an establishment of religion. The other clause, no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Interesting questions, of course, have been, well, what's an establishment of religion? What's free exercise? Some people's free exercise of religion are other people's establishment. Some people's non-establishment of religion is a restriction upon free exercise. And so the Supreme Court, particularly since the 1940s, has come up with guidelines and standards about what constitutes free exercise and what doesn't, and what constitutes an impermissible establishment of religion and what doesn't. And they've often been criticized for doing so, that their standards have been incoherent. But what I've seen the Supreme Court trying to do is balance these two considerations, free exercise and non-establishment. These two clauses, I think, are in tension with one another. Some people try to maximize free exercise. Well, when you do that, a consequence sometimes is a practical establishment of a particular group of people and their religion and their free exercise. Some people try to maximize non-establishment, independence of religion and government, separation of church and state, which I'm strongly inclined toward myself. But the problem is, sometimes that has been a restriction upon what at least some people claim to be their free exercise. So the Supreme Court, recognizing this tension, has tried to balance the two. They've tried not to maximize one or the other, but to optimize, to come up with the best balance that they can. But in order to illustrate that tension, I first of all, on this page, gave an account of James's belief strategies, my development of James's belief strategies, what I've already shown you. And on the back page, I applied that to issues of First Amendment. The religious liberty priority. The accommodationists want to maximize free exercise. The separationists wanted to minimize establishments of religion. Those are two different goals. Those are two different concerns. Both of them are a part of religious liberty, but they are distinguishable concerns and distinguishable priorities. Here's where sometimes you look over a manuscript and you look over a manuscript and then you look over what they send you and somehow you still overlook an error. The greater concern, the unaccepted risk of accommodation is restriction of free exercise. That's what they don't want to happen. The greater concern, the unacceptable risk of the separationists is some promotion of what they would see as establishments. The lesser concern, the accepted risk of the accommodationist, is promotion of establishments. They're willing to risk that. The lesser concern, the accepted risk of the separationist, is some degree of restriction of free exercise. Again, notice that the greatest concern, the unaccepted risk of the accommodationist, is the accepted risk of the separationist. The greatest concern, the unacceptable risk of the separationist, is the accepted risk of the accommodationist. So when it comes to the benefit of the doubt, if you're accommodationist, you give that benefit of the doubt to accommodationist policies, to maximizing or at least increasing free exercise. Separationism, you give the benefit of the doubt to separationist policies that in some ways restrict people's religious activities. For instance, putting 10 Commandments monuments in these state capitol building in Alabama, which Judge Roy Moore did many years ago and was ruled unconstitutional, and they had to get rid of it. Burden of proof by the accommodationist is upon the separationist. Burden of proof of the separationist is upon the accommodationist. Who has to make their case? Separationist says the accommodationist does. Accommodationist says the separationist does. What's the intended result? More free exercise. That's good. The separationist, the intended result, fewer establishments. That's also good. Problem is, the unintended result of the accommodationist, not only are you going to have more free exercise, but you're at least going to have de facto establishments of religion. The majority religion is going to have more opportunities, more powerful, more preferences. The unintended result of the separationist is less free exercise because you're trying to disempower religious groups and institutions. Now again, I know that's running through a lot of stuff that really takes a lot more time even to deal with, but that's how I applied this Jamesian belief strategies and will to believe thing in a realm outside of philosophy, outside of questions about the existence of God. And I think one of the reasons why my little book got a little bit of attention is it did things like that. It did take some novel directions and at least offer some suggestions there. And then it occurs to me, and then I'm going to kind of stop and open this up. It occurs to me that many of the decisions that we make in politics, that this Jamesian approach to belief strategies and belief policies could shed light on. At least it happened for me in the presidential election. Now again, I'm going to speak personally here. When I viewed the two major political candidates, I had major reservations about both of them. I think I had a lot of negatives when I thought of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Not completely negative, but I had a lot of major negatives that made Hillary Rodham Clinton, for me, not a good candidate in my judgment. At the same time, I had major negative judgments toward Donald J. Trump, which also made him not a good candidate for me, in my judgment. I think that I'm not necessarily the only one in the United States that had that feeling, but we were going to elect a president. These are the two major candidates. They're the only two that had an actual chance of becoming president. So the question was what to do. Who to support if you supported either one. Who to vote for if you voted for either one. I think that many people's political views and political decisions are not based upon sufficient evidence. I don't think that a lot of people who voted for Hillary Clinton had sufficient evidence that she would make the best president. Some think they did. I don't think that many of them did. I also don't think that many people who voted for Donald J. Trump, in my judgment, my opinion, had sufficient evidence to think he would make the best president. Neither way did you have sufficient evidence to make a judgment decision, at least from my perspective, between the two. So I had two options. I could make a decision based upon what I hope might happen with a Hillary Clinton, and maybe vote for her, even though I don't have evidence, because that's a hope. Whatever she's going to do is in the future. I could make a decision to vote for Donald Trump because of what I hope that Donald Trump would do in the future, but that's not evidence now because that's in the future. Or I could simply choose not to vote for either one of them. It wasn't just one or the other. And even not voting for one or the other, there's not sufficient evidence in my judgment for me to choose that one as well. So I had to make a choice. I had to make a very personal choice that I could not justify in terms of sufficient evidence. My basic approach in that issue was I wanted to avoid error. Because I didn't know that I had enough evidence to hope for something actually true or what. I wanted to avoid error. In my own judgment and perspective, I thought that if I voted for Hillary Clinton, there's a big chance I've made a mistake here. But if I voted for Donald Trump, I also judge if I vote for him, there's a big chance I will be making a mistake here. I ended up not voting for either one of them. Now, I'm not commending me. I'm not saying this is the right thing to do. What I'm saying is that in this situation of ambiguity, evidential ambiguity, in which at least I, from my perspective, according to my judgment, did not have sufficient evidence to lead me to believe I should vote this way or believe I should vote that way, I, in essence, suspended judgment. I, in essence, did not vote. But even that was grounded in my passional nature. It was rooted in subjective or personal values that not everyone shares with me. So I happen to think that there are many things that people believe in life that if they were to reflect upon them carefully, they don't have anything like what W.K. Clifford we were supposed to have about everything we believe. He said it's always wrong, everywhere, for anyone to believe anything without sufficient evidence. You and I believe all sorts of things without sufficient evidence. And I'm not saying we go implicitly or explicitly through kind of Jamesian process in doing so, but I think James may shed some light about how to deal with evidential ambiguity and also to recognize that ultimately we make a decision that's personal, that's passional, for which we have responsibility, and that other people are going to make very different decisions from their passional nature, according to their personal judgment, for which they are responsible. So I hope there's been some kind of thread, logic here from what I've moved from one thing to another, some type of coherence. Part of me feels I've just been kind of throwing things out about William James. But I think I'm just going to stop there and see what your comments or your questions may be. So what are your comments or your questions? Maybe I'll have some intelligent response to make.
Small question and a comment. The question is, when I put these two pages side by side, accommodation and separationism, on this side it says that avoid error, the burden of proof is more strict. Is that true also for this side of the page that I'm looking at? If is the burden of proof that is placed upon accommodation?
This isn't, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
Yeah. This is not isomorphic. I'm not doing exactly the same thing in both situations. I'm recognizing that there's a yin and a yang when it comes to belief adoption, and there's a yin and a yang when it comes to accommodation and separation in First Amendment. So you're right to raise the question. This is not simply a transference of gain truth, avoid error over to issues of either accommodate religions or separate religion from government. So I'm not doing exactly the same thing. Sorry for the confusion.
That's okay. The little comment that I have is when I teach statistics, not believe P though P is true is rejecting a true hypothesis, and the second one is acceptance of the false hypothesis. When I teach statistics, that's exactly what we do.
Okay.
We try to reduce the probability of believing or accepting a false hypothesis.
Well, and it's my understanding that, again, there are different philosophies of science, different ways of understanding science. But many people understand science in terms not so much of confirmation but disconfirmation. That what you do is, okay, you have a question that arises for certain data, you form a hypothesis. You deduce certain consequences that you would expect would occur if the hypothesis were true, and then you test. Well, one view is that this testing is to confirm the hypothesis. Another view is that, no, you're testing to disconfirm the hypothesis. And if the hypothesis survives this effort at disconfirmation, then it's sustained so far as it can do it. Because there are questions, well, how much confirmation do you have in order to accept a hypothesis, and then it becomes a theory, whatever. So I think there are different approaches to what science is about, but oftentimes it is, the principal goal is disconfirmation, avoiding error. And then if it can survive that disconfirmation approach and avoid error, then that gives you reason to accept it or to embrace it. Until maybe later on there's some disconfirmation. Is that kind of in league with what you're saying? Well, I'm glad to hear that it's supported by what you do, okay? That's part of the reason we would present this.
What we do, we use the example of criminal justice.
Yeah.
You want to use the probability
Yes.
of sending a person to jail.
Yes.
That guy might be innocent.
Yes, we have a presumption of innocence. Because in our criminal justice system, we have certain values. We would rather a guilty person go free than an innocent person be convicted. That's not shared by all systems throughout the world, by any means. Some of you will be familiar with the new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. And she has revised some guidelines for Title IX in terms of sexual harassment on campuses. And she's been criticized by some for doing so, and she's being applauded by some for doing so. Now, whatever your views on that may be, and I am again speaking off the cuff and not as an expert, it does seem to me, though, that when it came to Title IX issues and charges of sexual harassment, the values had become inverted. We didn't want somebody who'd actually committed sexual harassment to go free. Therefore, we were inclined to put the burden of proof upon the defendant and to accept the claim of sexual harassment. That was in some ways, in my judgment, inconsistent with our legal system, and therefore Betsy DeVos, in my judgment, is trying to bring it more into conformity there. Hopefully I'm clear about that. But you're absolutely right. In our judicial system, and I agree with it, we want to avoid the error of convicting an innocent person. We are willing to run the risk of setting free a guilty person. This is one of my major objections, by the way, to capital punishment, the death penalty. I'm concerned about the execution of innocent persons. Because you execute an innocent person, that's a harm that you cannot undo. And I think it is very reasonable to hold we have executed persons who are innocent. So I'd rather a lot of people who, according to a God's eye point of view, or even some of my own convictions, deserve death, I'd rather them not get death than convict and execute somebody who didn't deserve to die. That's my own personal view. Bill?
These considerations also come up with clinical trials for new vaccines, because you say, well, how reliable is it going to be? What is the risk that it won't work? And how can you tell that it's going to be effective? And so they sort of presume, well, let's presume that it's not effective and see if we can disprove that null hypothesis.
And the burden of proof is upon showing that you got to prove say it again, I'm sorry.
You have to somehow show that, okay, we gave this treatment and the patient got better, but we want to try to somehow have a statistical measure that it didn't happen just by chance.
Yeah.
That the probability of them getting better just by chance, okay, that it didn't happen by chance. And so we want to conclude that the medicine is working. You know, that's the thing. And so you have to make these decisions, because what you don't want to do is make a poor decision and say, it works, it's great. And then they put it out in the general population, and it has very bad unintended consequences.
Which later on lawyers be advertising on late night TV to call in so that you can get your money.
And every year we kind of go through this with the flu shot, okay, which I'm told that this year's flu, it's said on the news, is going to be particularly bad. And they want everybody who's able-bodied to get their flu shot, advertisement for flu shots, get your flu shot ASAP, you know, as soon as you can, so that it will have more time to work with your body's defenses and you build up your immunity earlier, you know, than later. So you have a better chance of not getting the flu.
And again, I think we widely do practice in many areas this avoid error strategy. And I think William James was not necessarily claiming these are an even par. I think what James could recognize, in fact, I think he did recognize that for many issues, it's best to adopt the avoid error strategy. But he said on some particularly important issues that have special importance, and for some people the question of God is an especially important issue. For some people, choosing hopefully the best presidential candidate is an important issue. In the sphere of personal relationships, these are important issues, that in some issues, important issues, we have a right to adopt this belief, gain truth strategy. To depart from kind of the usual standard avoid error approach and to engage in the gain truth strategy. One of the problems there is that you can engage in confirmation bias.
You apply it to choosing a mate.
Yes. Or remaining married to a mate. So I've used this illustration in my classes before. Maybe my wife when she was working at University of St. Thomas, and she said, well, she had to go to some convention, in Washington or whatever. I tell my students, well, she says she's in Washington, D.C. She says she's attending a conference. Is it possible that she's in Cancun with some secret lover? Well, it's possible. So what, in terms of my relationship with my wife, should I engage in a trusting attitude or a distrusting attitude? Should I look for the things that would encourage me to affirm our relationship, or should I look for disconfirming evidence that would undermine the relationship? I dare say that if we adopted the strict avoid error strategy in this field of personal relationships, we wouldn't have too many intimate personal relationships. Because we would put all the burden of proof, well, you got to prove to me that you're faithful to me. You got to prove to me you were doing what you're doing, rather than taking their word for it, giving them the benefit of the doubt, that sort of thing.
So what's the middle ground there? You can approach your example, the glass is half full, with respect to whether your wife is in Cancun or not, or you can approach it, the glass is half empty. I think there's a good chance she's in Cancun on the beach. What's the melioristic middle ground? Because you said James carves out this middle ground.
Well, he does in terms of our action in the world to make the world a better place. I'm not sure there's a middle ground between these two strategies. I think that these are simply two strategies, and I think one can predominate towards one and more toward the one and less toward the other. I think in many cases you might adopt an avoid error strategy, but in some particularly momentous, important cases you adopt the gain truth strategy. I'm not sure there is a middle ground between the two, other than perhaps they can serve as a kind of dialectic in your thinking, back and forth between the two, which I think sometimes is the case. But even in that case, I think you're probably, even if you're trying to kind of stand, both in gain truth, avoid error, I still think you're going to kind of lean one way or rather the other, as opposed to the other. So I'm not sure there is a middle ground between the two.
Talk about dialectic and opposed Hegelian.
I don't recall, because I don't know. I don't know. I simply do not know.
I wish people got married, and this is also true of myself, understood that, okay, you're getting married, but you have to realize that 20, 30 years hence, you're each going to be married to different people in a sense, because each of you are going to grow. And you're going to change. And so it's like, how much trust are you willing to
I think that the other really important point you made was about process, right? And if James is a quintessential American philosopher, in part because of his fascination with nature as open-ended and just the concept of process, then the quintessential all-American sport, baseball, right, participates in that. That's why it's the World Series and not the Super Bowl. It's a process, right? And yes, you beat this team triumphed on this location, but it's a process. Let's see how it looks over the series. And I think there's some connection here between the American fascination with open-endedness and process, and the way something like baseball is conceived and what James is getting at.
And you can even see that as experimental as well. You're not going to do just one trial to establish the safety of a drug. You're not going to do one game to establish the world champion. You're going to have 7 games. Now, would 9 be better? I don't know. Maybe so, maybe not. Would 5 be better? I think no, that'd be too few. So you come up with this number of 7 that you'll get. I still want to get back to your point about the initial decision to get married, though, because this is a good one. You know, if you're trying to avoid error, you may never get married. Okay? You might never get married. So there's a certain amount of risk. There's a certain amount of faith. There's a certain amount of openness toward the future that's involved in a decision, any kind of relationship, but a decision to get married, okay? And many people, again, view the question of God as the truth or falsity of a particular proposition. God exists, okay? But if God exists, it's a matter of a relationship. And I'm not necessarily talking about a pious, but it's about a relationship between an individual and this divine reality. It's not just a proposition you're dealing with. It's not just an abstract question you're dealing with. It's about a relationship. And James knew enough about religious experience. He couldn't talk about religion simply in terms of statements and propositions and beliefs, whatever. He understood the personal, existential, emotional dynamics of religion. And therefore, in the context of relationship, the idea of a gain truth strategy to the question of the existence of God makes perfect sense. If all you think about does God exist as being whether a particular statement's true or false, this Jamesian approach might not be as acceptable to you, particularly if you're of the avoid error type. I wish John Bryant emailed me and said he would not be able to be here today, but I wish we did have somebody from psychology, because they'd be able to chime in and make statements that I can't make about just how influential, how significant James is as the father of American psychology, his book Principles of Psychology and whatever. I'm simply not conversant with his impact upon that particular area.
I have a question, because as I was sitting here looking at the 2 columns, the gain truth, avoid error, I've lost family members because of my political affiliation. My family members are predominantly another type of political affiliation. I am one that is considered strange for me to be, but I am. And as I'm looking at the gain truth and avoid error, it's almost a way to be able to have a political conversation, because if you're looking at the way someone may approach a political process or a particular situation, if you're looking at it from this standpoint, you begin to understand that their method or their reasons for so are because they are trying to avoid an error or making a mistake. Whereas on the other side, you could have the person saying, no, we want to get at the heart of the matter and to resolve this. So both approaching the same entity, so to speak, and it not necessarily be racism or some kind of ism, but a foundation within them when you're talking about personal, of avoiding error. Because if that personality is, wait, I'd much rather do this to avoid making a mistake, versus the other one who might say, but no, I want to reach this truth because I believe that this utopian, whatever the topic is, then you begin to see it from a different standpoint versus the isms that are attached to individuals when they utter words from their mouth. As you watch the political scheme, you talked about that when you started, depending on who the person is, immediately an ism is attached to them depending on their words. But if we were looking at it from the Jamesian and thinking about, okay, their reason may be, their mindset is, look, rather than to make a mistake, I'd rather do this.
Yeah. I have found it difficult to talk with some people. I'm very selective about who I talk with politics, whatever. And if I talk about it in general setting, I make this is my perspective. But I've talked to some people for whom Hillary Clinton could do no wrong. So and since I'm a void error person, I find it difficult to talk to people for whom Hillary Clinton could do no wrong. I've also talked to people for whom Donald J. Trump can do no wrong. And again, I have this avoid error strategy, so I have difficult talk. I basically redirect the conversation. Now, somebody wants to talk with me about, both those candidates had strengths and weaknesses, and boy, Hillary had her downside and Donald had his downside. Okay, well then what did you do there? Well, I held my nose and voted or whatever. I took a risk. I talk to people like that. It's the true believers, the gain truthers in this particular context, I've had difficulty. So whether I adopt the gain truth or avoid error strategy is contextual. It depends upon the issue. It depends upon what values I have that are at stake. Sometimes I'm avoid error, and sometimes I'm gain truth. I have found it very difficult, though, in politics to be a gain truther, one way or the other. My natural temperament and logic is to be avoid error. I don't expect as much out of politics as many people do.
But I was just,
No, makes a great point.
I'm still in my utopia where eventually one day, possibly in the future.
But James would remind us, see, this is part, I think, of the heat in our politics. There are liberals and progressives that think if we could just get those conservatives out of the way, we could have something approaching a liberal utopia. There are conservatives who think if we could just get those liberals out of the way, we'd have something that we would have a conservative utopia. And James, I think, would remind us that utopian thinking of left or right, conservative or liberal, is mistaken. That what we can do is we can try to make the world a better place. And this is one reason why sometimes I describe myself as a liberal conservative and sometimes as a conservative liberal. I think change has to take place. I'm a conservative enough to say it should be incremental. The burden of proof should be upon the change. But sometimes the change does fulfill that burden of proof. So though I'm conservative by temperament, and I'm generally conservative in my political approach and typically vote more conservative, I've come to some conclusions that others would view as being very liberal. So I'm on record, I'm on YouTube advocating equal rights for gay persons, both in society and in churches. And if all they knew about Mark Whitten was what they saw in those YouTube videos, they'd think I was some flaming liberal. I'm not. They would wonder, well, how is that consistent with also being conservative? It is, but because I'm not a utopian liberal and I'm not a utopian conservative. I'm not a true believer liberal. I'm not a true believer conservative. I tend to be more of a take it slow, take it easy, avoid error.
Let me ask, we have a bunch of mathematicians here. From your experience with math students, do they tend to be more able to grasp the mathematics if they are one type of thinker as opposed to another, avoid error kind of thinker as opposed to believing type of thing? I can say with respect to writing anyway, I've had many students who had a very difficult time because they were the avoid error, the Freudian anal, I must get it right or I cannot do it. They tend to shade off into perfectionism. They never finish what they start. It's a problem. It's a problem. On the other hand, you don't want the student who's just going to throw it all up on the wall and something will stick, and you don't want that either, right? Now, with respect to with math, though, what's been your experience?
Well, I think you're right. Same thing in writing. You don't want to put the comma in the wrong place. And so you fret over this so much that you forget what it is you're really trying to express. And so I've had students obsess over where to put the minus sign, especially with rational numbers. Do I put it in the numerator, the denominator, or off to the side? And they're so concerned about sort of the presentation of the final result that they don't take as much risk. I mean, there's this thing of, I've got to write down this string of symbols in the right way one time, okay? And I hate to erase, okay? I hate to go back. But then there's others who, okay, I missed it there, let me adjust this, and they're more relaxed about it. I found that those who are more tight, that don't want to see that there's many ways to approach something. If they're just so tight and so intent, okay, there's a white knuckle.
Is the avoid error type of personality essentially mediocre?
I don't think so.
I don't think they are. The process of learning, you have different types of students. When I think of avoid error, as it is presented here, they tend to be like what Bill is saying. They know a way that works. They have found that way works. Thus, for them, that is truth that's been substantiated. What bothers them sometimes when you try to feed in other ways to arrive at this truth. Then it's like, well, you know, when I was in high school, when I was in grandma's, whatever it was, this is how we did it, and it worked. Now you're trying to introduce and convince me that these other ways yield this result. And Bill is right about that negative in the...
If they're looking at the course as a terminal course.
Yes.
And the oddity is that if you adopt an avoid error strategy, you're so concerned about avoiding errors, you're likely not to succeed and actually achieve what you were trying to avoid is the error. Getting back to baseball, I played baseball in high school, okay? Now, I was not a great baseball player, but I was a good baseball player in a small school. I played Pony League, Colt League, high school. I was a catcher, and I was a pretty good batter. But I wish somebody had coached me about the psychology of hitting. I was deathly afraid of striking out. Now, Ron and others of you know this is the worst thing you could do. Go up to the plate afraid of striking out. Trying to avoid striking out. If there's one thing to guarantee you're going to strike out more, go up to the plate trying to avoid striking out. I should have gone to the plate with trying to get a hit, envisioning getting a hit. I would have struck out fewer times and I would have been a better hitter. It does seem to me, though, that perhaps creative geniuses are gain truth people. Okay? Avoid error people may be very good technicians and accomplish a lot, but your true creative geniuses seem to me to be the people who do take the risks, who do leap beyond the evidence, who do have a vision of what could possibly be, not what probably is. So the pathfinders, the geniuses, seem to me, if we were, again, trying to characterize in one way or the other here, would be more the gain truth people. Maybe afterwards, after they've explored the pathway, other people will then check up on it and do the avoid error stuff. But at least the initial breakthrough, the creative insight, the creative genius that accomplishes something new, seems to me would be more consistent with gain truth.
No, I wasn't sure that applies or not, but we have a lot of students in math that are so afraid of it, they block themselves, you know. But if they were more open-minded, they would learn them. But they're so, uptight.
I think it's a general trend of all students in colleges and universities these days. Is that there's such a huge idea of avoiding risk, just avoiding the risk, and I don't want to take any useless classes. I've got to make sure that I get through the program ASAP as fast as possible. And just
I feel like it's in the stock market, no risk, no gain.
All these about issues that are of importance to the individual. And what is important is a matter of values, and values are very personal. And so there are going to be different orientations.
I've also noticed through the years is that, you give a review before a test. And I've just noticed that the questions I get are more and more and more and more and more questions, trying to find out exactly what's going to be on that exam, okay? Because what they're trying to do is minimize risk that you'll be faced with a question that you don't know how to respond to, okay? And so the just very risk avoidance. And it kind of makes me afraid because it's like, look, guys, the real test is your life. And you can't minimize every risk in your life. Okay? You've got to practice dealing with ambiguity. And boy, that's a hard sell. People don't want to do that.
There's this great scene near the end of the film Bull Durham. You've seen Bull Durham?
Snippets of it.
Great baseball film. And there's this player who is, he's asked at one point by another player. This other player was a great star, but he's on the decline now. But he asks this player, well, what's the thing you're most afraid of? He's playing a new position. This player. What's the thing you're most afraid of? He says, probably that the ball gets hit to me. Right? The guy who asks the question was a great star, even though he's on the decline. He's still head and shoulders beyond this guy. He said, well, good luck with that. And he walks away.
I mean, because whenever you get these questions, I get questions. How many points are you going to take off if this happens? How many points are you going to take off if this happens? All right? These are all risk avoidance, type of things. They want to know in advance. And it's almost like if I give too vague an answer, all right, then it's like, well, you said that a minus sign was worth 1 point, and I lost 2 points. And treat it as a contractual obligation.
Don't you think that's in part the public school system, unfortunately, bears some responsibility there because of the numbers of students and the way they have to be taught and the way they are taught nowadays, not necessarily by the best and the brightest. And it all tends to come down to these statistical ways of moving people to the left or to the right, and you got 3 right, and so you're over here, and you got 3 wrong, and you're over there. There's very little emphasis on critical thinking. So they get to us, and they're still thinking within that paradigm, right? And they can't break out of it.
Got to meet the standard for the federal funding, and so many people have to take the standardized test. Yes. Yeah.
I guess if Edison had been an avoid error person, he would never have invented the light bulb.
Well, think of all the mistakes he made before it worked.
Yeah. I've heard he went through over about like 100 trials or whatever before he finally figured out how to do it right.
Or how many elections did Abraham Lincoln lose before he became president?
Oh.
That's an amazing example to me. Lost.
This is why I think it's particularly interesting that you might call it the discourse or the ideology of success, as it were, that dominates a lot of public education discourse, is misguided. It's really the ideology of failure we should be talking about, because that would be more fundamentally American, right? There is no real failure in America. It's always been whatever happens to you, you spin it and make it a success and move on. That's the pragmatic approach. But the way we tend to think of success as something static, it's not American, all right? And it doesn't encourage students to get up, dust themselves off, and keep moving. Did I get it right? No. Oh my God,
And I never will. If it's wrong the first time, then ergo, it will be wrong every subsequent time.
I'll never learn.
Okay, and that's why there's that first test pressure. Okay,
what about philosophy students? Do you find philosophy students who have you ever had a brilliant avoid error philosophy student, or is it a different kind of brilliance than the one that we have, the more not so risk averse kind of student?
Well, I think any good student in general, a philosophy student in particular, is always going to be going beyond the given, going beyond what could be established or probabilities or whatever. Never really thought about in terms of those categories before. I think there is the possibility of brilliance in an avoid error strategy, but in terms of creativity, creative brilliance, I would tie that to gain truth. I know that many students will not speak up in class because they're afraid of saying something stupid. They're afraid of saying something wrong instead of the possibility, hey, I could say something intelligent, that would get the professor's attention or whatever. So I do think there is this kind of mindset in part that we don't want to fail. We don't want to be seen as failing. We don't want to take a risk of failing. We'd rather not fail than succeed sometimes.
So it's almost like we need a Seinfeld reverse reality. So I would ask you, Bill, well, how many of your students failed this semester? And you'd say, 75%. Yes!
And just wait till next term when I get tougher.
Because with the appropriate understanding of what that means, they're still moving on, they're still going, they're still, right? But if the understanding is, well, once you fail, it's over, that's a different model. It's not American.
What's the old statement? It's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. So again, back to your personal relationships, you take a risk, it's a gain truth. Sometimes you love and you lose.
I was thinking about that Pascal wager argument.
Yeah, and I think Pascal in his own way asked a significant question. What do you have to gain and what do you have to lose? What do you have to risk in believing in God or not believing in God? Now, he dressed it up as a kind of, the wager, but whatever. But I think there is a legitimate question there. What do you have to gain? What do you have to lose? What do you have to risk if you believe in God? What do you gain? What do you have to lose? What do you have to risk if you don't believe in God? And everybody has to answer that personally and existentially, but I think that's a legitimate question. Now, how you fill out the answer, well, I'll gain heaven or I'll avoid hell, might not be particularly admirable. I think it was William James who said that if you went to heaven because you engaged in some kind of Pascalian wagering, God will send you to hell anyway, because you went for the wrong motives. It was kind of an economic, prudential thing rather than true faith or love.
How unpragmatic. What difference do the motives make? No, really.
I think he was criticizing something the values that were at work there. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't James, but somebody said that. But again, what do you have? And again, there are risks that you run both ways.
You talk about the true believer of this political party, and the true believer of this other party. What came to my mind was the Nietzschean quote of, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of the truth than lies."
Well, conviction sometimes will bring closure, and lies have a way perhaps of still promoting openness, I guess.
Wow, that's a subject for your next time.
Oh, I don't know. Thank you very much. Thanks for all of your responses. Appreciate it.